this video, I'm going to show you how I made this workbench for my garage that folds down and tucks nicely out of the way when I'm not using it. I just recently moved into a new house and my garage is currently a disorganized mess. I really enjoy working on DIY projects, and so it's really important to me to have a space where I can organize my tools and also have a space to work on those projects. So I decided my first project would be building a workbench. I wanted to make sure that my workbench was in a location where I would have easy access to electricity for my power tools. The only place in my garage that has power outlets is towards the front of the garage. And I knew I couldn't put a traditional workbench in that area because I also want to be able to park my cars in that space. So I decided that a fold-down workbench would be the best design option in order to accomplish those goals. With that decision made, the next step was to get to work measuring the space. I decided on a 5-foot-long workbench that had a depth of 2.5 feet away from the wall, with a height of 3 feet from the floor. Next, I got on Amazon and went shopping for some heavy-duty brackets. I found these brackets that are rated at 550 pounds, which I figure would be sufficient for anything that I ever attempted to do. Here is a complete listing of all of the materials and tools that I used to complete this project. When I went shopping for the plywood, I asked a hardware store employee to cut the plywood for me into my desired dimensions. Be sure to take advantage of this service that they offer. It's very convenient. Once you have everything that you need, the next step is to get to work marking the measurements on your wall. The front of my garage has a 3-inch step in the place where my workbench is going to go. And the thickness of the plywood that I purchased for this workbench was 1 inch. The original height that I wanted for my workbench was 36 inches. So from the top of the step, I measured 32 inches and marked the wall. Then I grabbed my level just to do a quick check and make sure that the marks that I made were nice and straight. I grabbed my stud finder in order to locate where the studs were behind the drywall. Since I'm planning on putting some weight on this workbench, and it will be heavily used, I wanted to make sure that it gets anchored into some studs as opposed to just screwing it into the drywall and using some wall anchors to hold it in place. Be sure to mark where the stud starts and stops on your wall. This will help you find the center of each stud. Next, I measured from the center of one stud to the center of the next stud to find the distance between them. Then I did a little math to figure out how much overhang there would be on the left and the right sides of the studs. I calculated this distance to be 13.75 inches. Then I took out my tape measure again and marked this 13.75 inch distance on both the left and the right sides of the stud. In this way, I'm able to see exactly where the workbench is going to fit on the wall. This next step is completely optional, so feel free to skip on to step 4 if you don't feel that you need this. Since the brackets are skinny and made of metal, I had some concerns that they might do some damage to my drywall as I was moving them up and down every time that I wanted to use my workbench. My plan to address this issue was just to make a little brace for the bracket to drill into so that it didn't directly press into my drywall. I lined up one of the brackets on a piece of scrapboard from the plywood purchase for this project, and I started to take some measurements. I found that the side of the bracket that was going to be attached to the wall is 8 inches. So I added 2 inches to this length for a total of 10 inches. and I decided on a 4-inch wide piece. So the dimensions of this brace ended up being 10 inches tall and 4 inches wide. I wanted 2 of these, one for each bracket. I made my markings on the scrap piece of plywood and then proceeded to cut them out. I also decided to add a little decorative flair to these braces. So I cut the ends at 45-degree angles with my miter saw. And I also grabbed my router and dressed up the edges a bit just so that it looked a little more rounded and a little bit nicer, even though I was just using a scrap piece of plywood. Remember, if you're ever working with power tools, be safety conscious. Make sure you have glasses on to protect your eyes and earplugs in to protect your ears. Also, as soon as you're finished using a power tool, always remember to unplug it right away just to avoid any accidents in your workshop. For this next step, you're going to want to grab your sanding tool and sand all of the wood surfaces on this project. I sand using a 2-step process. I'll start with a rough grit sandpaper first, like this one. And then I'll go again with a very fine grit sandpaper, just to make it nice and smooth to the touch. Don't forget to flip your board over and repeat this process on the back side. Plus, if you made any braces from step 3 of this project, go ahead and sand those down too. This next step is completely optional. I just wanted to jazz up my workbench a little bit by staining it a provincial wood stain color. And because I know I'm going to batter this thing up pretty well through my use of it, I wanted to also apply a sealer to protect it just a little bit more. If you prefer a natural wood finish, feel free to skip this step and move on to step number 6. Feel free to apply as many coats of stain as you like in order to get the desired finish. I usually apply 2 coats of stain in order to darken up the initial application. Don't forget to read the instructions on your jar of stain. It has helpful instructions on the amount of time that you should wait for the stain to dry in between each application. Then just flip the board over and get both sides. To seal this project, I'm using a warm satin polyurethane sealant. I apply this with a foam roller to get as smooth of a finish as possible. I usually apply at least 2 or 3 coats of sealer. In between each coat, I'll use an extremely fine grit sandpaper, like this one, and this just ensures that the surface is as smooth and glossy as possible. Now we're ready to start the process of installing the brackets into the wall. There are 3 pre-drilled holes in this bracket, so the first thing I did was line up the bracket in the center of the braces that I made. I used a tape measure just to confirm that the bracket was lined up in the center. Once everything was lined up, I traced the location of those holes so that I'd be able to see them on the brace. The kit for the brackets came with a set of screws for installation, but I did want to go ahead and pre-drill the holes for these screws. I selected a drill bit that perfectly matched the diameter of the screws, but was still small enough that the screw threads were still able to grab into the wall. I ended up using a 1/8 size drill bit. Then I used that drill bit to drill into the holes that I had previously marked on all of the braces. If you chose not to make braces, then you would do this same thing, but just against the wall itself. Next, I wanted to pre-drill into the wall using the markings that I had already made into the braces. So I lined up my drill marks with the center of one of the studs, used a level to double check that everything was lined up, and then drilled through the brace right into those pre-drilled holes so that I would have the same drill marks in the wall to use as a guide when I put this all together. Then I took my drill and drilled into each of those marks just to make sure that the drill did actually get into the stud itself, because my drill bit wasn't really that long. And now it's time to put it all together. So I used the screws that came with the kit to attach the bracket to the brace that I had made. I didn't drill these in all the way. Just think of getting the screws set into position so that when you drill it into the wall, it becomes a little easier. I also had a bit of trouble getting my drill to reach the screws on 2 of those locations, so I used a drill bit extender to help me out. And now I'm ready to drill this guy into the wall. I drilled the screws through a little bit so they poked out the backside, just so that I could line up the screws with the holes that I pre-drilled into the wall. Now just line those screws up, drill it into the wall. Be sure to check it with a level and tighten up those screws. After installing both brackets, I checked it with a level again, and it looks good. All that's left to do is grab the workbench surface itself and screw it into place. Make sure that it's lined up with the markings that you made earlier in step number 2 of this video, and then your table should be perfectly centered above those 2 brackets. I did decide to go ahead and pull the table away from the wall just a little bit so that when I'm folding it up and down, it doesn't leave any marks on the wall. Now it's time to use the smaller screws that came with the bracket kit and screw straight through the bracket up into the workbench. It might be helpful if you have another person to put some weight on the top of the workbench for you while you screw those screws up into the wood surface. The kit only came with 3 small screws for each bracket. However, there are 4 holes that are pre-drilled into each of them. So if you want, you can go buy an extra set of 2 screws that match the ones that came in the kit so that you can have as much support as possible for your workbench. And that's it. Here's the new finished product. If you found this video helpful, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to my channel. Happy DIYing!